there, folks. I'm Layman Pascal, and this is the Integral Stages Meta Podcast series, where we podcasters, host the hosts, and probe into people who are trying to bring forward higher, deeper, and more transformative perspectives through online media. Today, we're sitting down with Michael Garfield from the Complexity and Future Fossils podcasts, and one of the guys most often mentioned to me personally as an inspiration by other podcasters in this ostensible meta discourse space. I did have a list of questions, but I've thrown them out, and I now want this to be an open experiment and a free-roaming exploration of the highlands of weirdness. And this mad scientist from the future is probably just the guy to help. Hi, Michael.
Hi, Layman. The highlands of weirdness. I love it. Yeah, you know, the first episode of Complexity that we did, David Krakauer, who is the mad genius president of the Santa Fe Institute, he was articulating his intellectual landscape, you know, which actually instantiates in the physical landscape of the SFI campus, where you go out to the furthest, you go to the peaks, and on the peaks, that's where the discoveries are made. And then from the top of the holy mountain, you bring it down like the Zen ox herding pictures, you know, into the city, into the marketplace. And so that kind of rhymes with William Irwin Thompson's comment that novelty emerges into the society through the crazies, the artists, the savants, and the pedants. It's sort of, David talks about the mountain, the monastery, which is where SFI is. Interestingly, like he doesn't quite, they're in the foothills of the Santa Fe Mountains, so it's not quite out, it's not as out there as people would like to think. You know, it's like, no, we still have to formalize things in mathematics. You know, you can't, like, we're not artists, okay? We're not crazy people, we're savants. But we're not pedants either. And so, like, I am definitely the one, like, up on the top of the mountain shouting, hey, you guys, there's a tidal wave coming. And they're like, yes, but can we mathematize it? You know, so anyway, I like the highlands of weirdness.
Yeah, God, that makes me think about this is the plot of Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra. It starts off, the guy's been up in the mountain for a while, and he has his revelation. The rest of it is he comes down and tries all these different ways to communicate it into the society. And you're like, yeah, but does it, you know, you wonder, does it really get communicated into the society, or at every step of instantiation into the architecture, does it lose the thing that made it the insight to the point where you end up with the same society you had before, just with a new package?
Yes, the appropriation and confirmation bias. And yeah, that whole nut, that's a fascinating one. That's something that folks at work are like terribly concerned with, you know, whereas I'm more concerned with the the importance of translation at every step of the process. Like, because I don't think that model is actually the Thus Spake Zarathustra / Krakauer model is necessarily complete, right? Because that makes it seem more linear than it really is. You know, I really like Tyson Yunkaporta at Deakin University. He wrote Sand Talk, How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the World. Yeah. And I've been chatting with him a little bit, hoping to get him on Future Fossils here soon. And he runs Indigenous Knowledge Systems Lab, where, you know, he's saying we need to do translation before we actually do the research. Like, that there's a circularity to this stuff, and that even with the circularity, it's not necessarily linear. Chris Kutarna at Oxford is another guy I've been talking to recently. He co-authored a book, The Age of Discovery. And he and I were talking about this thing that comes up, actually, Weird Studies. Those guys, J.F. Martell and Phil Ford, had Joshua Ramey on their show. Joshua Ramey wrote a book about the place of divination in science and in finance, these places where we don't think of divination as actually occurring. But when you look at, like, how did you decide to select that hypothesis in the first place? You know, you're not actually typically, I mean, this is kind of a new thing. We're using kind of like digital tools to augment divination now and identify blind spots in our, you know, like where scientific research is being done. But historically, it's more just like you're using your own unconscious processing to decide where you want to focus your attention. And now that unconscious processing has been outboarded in machines. And so, but regardless, it's still like a black box, And so there is a role for shadow even in the light of modernity. Anyway, I don't know if,
Yeah, there's just so many things there. The first thing I got in my mind was a picture of the problem with the guy comes down from the peak thing is that there's all these other peaks, right? There's like wherever you think there's empty space, there's actually a peak or 10,000 peaks at every scale. So then you're like, well, is it really operating as some kind of either holographic distribution of all these peaks working together or some kind of generalized collective coherence effect where all these peaks at all these scales collectively produce this thing or not? Which is often what the guy on the mountain is saying, but we treat him as if he was the source of the idea.
Yeah, that's the William Gibson future is here just distributed unevenly thing, or like William James pluralism, ontological pluralism even. I think that's something that really interested me about a paper co-authored by Simon DeDeo sometime in the last year. He's one of SFI's externals, and he was using Bayes' theorem, this like statistical approach to, Bayes. It's about the assumptions that you bring into assessing the probability of a situation. And he was saying, actually, when we talk about the explanatory value of a given description of the world, there's a difference between explanation and prediction, right? You can predict something very well without understanding it at all. That's like machine learning.
Yeah.
And you can understand something, right? You can understand something really well without being able to predict it at all, which is more like complex systems thinking. And then within explanation, there's actually more than one heuristic that determines whether the explanation satisfies you. So some people are looking for the most comprehensive, co-explanatory story about the world, and that's like conspiracy theory, right? Other people are looking for the shortest algorithm or the shortest equation that you can write that captures sufficient stuff. And so his point was just that, that even in hard science, that's a horrible term, but even in what considers itself hard science, you're not actually all gaming for the same virtue. That what keeps us honest intellectually is pluralism, is us having different explanatory goals and then comparing the results that we get. And so there's something, when I asked him about this stuff, writing a press release for this paper, I said, do you think that this is an argument that we're never going to find a unified theory of the universe? And he was like, yeah. He's like, actually, I think that in a way, seeking a unified theory leads us into something more like conspiracy theory thinking. It leads us into something where the virtue has become a vice because we're emphasizing one kind of explanatory approach over everything else. So yes, it's more than one peak, right?
That unity thing is intriguing to me. When I think about it in terms of scales or like, emergent levels of the process, you go, well, in order for anything to come up, then there's got to be something like a unifying principle and some other kind of diversification principle. And obviously you get too much of either and the thing crashes. So you got to like, well, how do we do that? How do we have, like, as a nation, how do we have enough homogeneity to viscerally tolerate the amount of diversity we have? Right. And so some people seem regressive because they want to cut down the amount of diversity in order to get back to the amount of coherence they need to have national spirit. And other people are like, oh, that's not going to work because that's an old fashioned form of national spirit. We have all this diversity we need to integrate. And they're like, yeah, but it's only integrated if it's integrated. If you don't unify that diversity to an optimal degree, you're just going to have diversity opposing itself from all directions.
So where is the threshold, right? Where is the sweet spot? And, that's the sort of Aristotelian golden mean. I've been thinking a lot about that lately in terms of the the way that I guess like Chris Langton in the 90s in SFI talked about, the transition from order through complexity to chaos, which is sort of, he analogized to the transition in thermodynamics from like solid to a phase transitional state to a fluid. And that rhymes with all of this other stuff, like the compositional techniques I think about as a musician, sitting down and composing a symphony, or like getting into a jazz ensemble where you have a structure, you have a head and kind of where you're going to break out and move into an improvisational thing, but you're listening a lot more to the other players. You're not all just reading a score. And then at some point you get to a completely different compositional technique, which is roll the dice, like the algorithmic approach, the complete hands off the wheel, just flail and see what sticks. And it seems that what determines which one of those is the appropriate strategy has to do with the pace at which the environment itself is changing. Where does jazz and algorithmic composition appear in music history? Phil Ford's musicology lectures that he put out last year on the Weird Studies Patreon, he was talking about, the aftermath of the world wars and the emergence of jazz and algorithmic composition as a response to the disruption of the narrative of progress of modern society. And so, this has a similar kind of insight when it comes to evolution and like when it's appropriate to tune your organism for efficiency versus when it's appropriate to tune your organism for evolvability or adaptability.
Yeah.
Or when you just want to like ramp the mutation rate as high as possible because you don't actually know what world you're evolving into. You just kind of want to, shoot out everything in every direction and see what works. But yeah, end rant.
It's a little bit dependent upon the context and the number of things that are being taken into account. Like that Aristotelian thing, I think we could update that a little bit and say, hey, what we think of as beautiful and maybe natural is a set of aesthetic and architectural configurations. And those things we evolved to really like because maybe they solve more problems than they create, right? Maybe this is the optimal style of doing things and we should converge on it. But it's proportional to how many things, like you're like, hey, there's an ideal organization for this many things. Oh, great. What about this many things? Right. So is it just me? Is it my brain? Is it my interior? Am I sitting there in the meditation room and organizing my emotions and my thoughts and my somatic sensations into an epiphany? Great. But then what about the other people? And then what about the situation? Like you're saying, what are the environmental factors? That's like another range. We go, okay, but that's just on this planet. What if we're actually serving some kind of function in the broader cosmos? We've got to take that into account. Then that's a whole different skewing in order to get that same kind of proportionality.
There's a great work of science fiction by Peter Watts, who was a marine biologist before he became an award-winning science fiction author, called Blind Sight, which is a very dark and provocative book. I thought it was so cool, I decided to start the Future Fossils book club just to talk about it with people. And the thesis of this book, it's like, it operates within the container of your typical like first contact trope, we're sending a ship out to meet the alien, but, and I don't know where I stand on the conclusions of this book, because I think in order to accept what he's saying, you have to accept a certain model of consciousness that I reject. But his argument was basically that you get there and the alien is a Chinese room. Like there's no there. There's no subject at all. It's immensely intelligent. In fact, it's smarter than we are, but it has no interiority. And so, his dark thesis, his like Lovecraftian supposition in this book is that consciousness is just a self-delusion. Like it's a local solution, but it's not a global solution, and that there are other more intelligent things out there in the cosmos that don't need it, that regard it as superfluous, that it actually slows us down when we encounter these things. It makes us more vulnerable than they are. And so we auto lose when we encounter them, And so I think that's worth, at least, even if he's wrong about the sort of ontological basis of interiority, he's right that we should not be so high on our own fumes. That humility is key.
I don't necessarily, at least behaviorally, and my intuition tends to think that there's all kinds of interiorities at all kinds of scales, and that a thing that's complex and can do all these things but doesn't have an interiority, well, actually, at some scale, all of its bits have some interiority too. Right. And I think it's an interesting thing to think about, because AIs could be like that. They could be super competent, more than us, but is there something in there or not? And if it says, hey, I'm in there, what does that mean? So I think it's really important for us to think about what it would be like to interact with systems like that. But for me personally, like the main thing is how much of what's relevant is not conscious, right? Like I come at this from a spiritual practice background. So the question is, everybody promotes consciousness. Great. Yay. But is it important? Is it important for me to know I'm having the experience? Is the degree of my beingness that I hope to evolve, is it important that I know about it, that I feel about it? Or should I be changing it? Is there this other part of me, or maybe it's the real me, and this is just an assistant at best? And the idea that I'm going to be conscious of whatever's arising, like that can't be the process then. If the consciousness is a trivial component, what are the practices which cause the subconscious self to evolve and spiritualize?
Right. I think people get tripped up using at least two different definitions of consciousness here, because I'm within the integral community. I think everyone's kind of familiar with the idea that consciousness doesn't simply mean self-reference. Or that's one thing, and the interiority is kind of a separate thing. The white-heading and prehension. But yeah, I mean, it is the case that we are vastly smarter than we are, in the sense of like, I am consciously identified with this guy, and that's not where really my insights come from. That's just how I organize my insights in order to communicate them or something. I'm really on the tip that the kind of self-aware consciousness that most people mean when they say that is something that only emerges within certain social milieus. Like the animal, the simplest animal that seems to pass the mirror test is the cleaner wrasse, which is this fish that is symbiotically cleaning other fish. And so it has to understand its relationship to these other fish. And it seems to recognize itself when we hold a mirror to it. So there is, it seems like that's the social component necessary, but it doesn't, I mean, at this point we know that that's a different kind of attention and a different kind of awareness than we're talking about when we talk about, just pure, like the interiority of interoperability or something.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're in deep at this point. I don't know, maybe we should switch tacks.
No, let's press on and see what happens. Yeah, consciousness is weird because people argue about it constantly, and they basically have too narrow a definition or aren't agreeing with each other. So the conversation goes nowhere. It's very easy. If somebody says absolutely not, consciousness doesn't go all the way down. You're like, no, it does. There's a subjectivity that's increasingly not present at smaller and smaller scales, to the point where when you get to things below organisms, it's basically like it's not there. You're like, oh, you guys are agreeing. That's interesting. Yeah. But yeah, the sense of I is really weird. I have two thoughts on the mirror thing. The first is, I usually think about it as a stage in the self-mapping operation, right? So the first thing is to use the body as a map. And then the next thing might be to start using symbols as a map, and switch over from the body map to the I concept or something like that. The other thing that always really intrigues me about that is the diversity of dominant communication styles in the animal world, it doesn't necessarily lend itself to our concept of the visual metaphor. And a lot of our talk about consciousness, and this is rife in Ken Wilber, it's really visual dominant as a processing style. You're going to be the witness. You're going to take a perspective. You're going to have a lens. And you go, well, okay, if I take another visually dominant creature and put it in front of a mirror, great, I can run this test. But what about a creature who doesn't use eyesight and navigates mostly in an olfactory sense? How do I build an olfactory mirror to test whether it has mirror stage complexity or not?
That's a very good point. I remember in 2005 visiting Ken's old house in the Boulder Hills and getting to see his library and just being, astonished at the number of books, right? But that's like a Marshall McLuhan thing. And that seems like, when I want to riff on Penn State's English professor, Richard Doyle, who I regard as just like a complete badass. And he talks about the proliferation of the surveillance state and how every camera begets another blind spot, right? And so you get into this. I've written quite a bit about the evolutionary arms race that happens when you do this. So somebody reading as many books as Ken, that's very much an embedment or an embeddedness in the Marshall McLuhan sort of visual partitioning that he talks about with literate culture and the written word. And, that's a world in which I, as an elder millennial, I guess, find myself kind of amphibiously related, right? That like here we are, the podcast is very much oral culture embedded within and sort of taking over written culture in some kind of way, or at least reasserting itself, being culturally reclaimed in that McLuhan sense. And, just to pull one other person in here, this is Doug Rushkoff, who's like deeply influenced by McLuhan, talks about the impact of digital information networks on the self in Present Shock. Have you read that one?
Present Shock, yeah.
Yeah. So he talks about narrative collapse and fractal noia. How like when everything is happening at once, you can't structure things in the same way. And that's exactly what McLuhan was getting at when he was talking about the return of oral cultures and neo-tribalism and the way that we see all of these towers that were, used as basically like observatories by a print culture are being pulled down right now by internet culture, and it's curious to think about, how, for instance, to riff with a loop back to what we were talking about many peaks, what it means for the ivory tower to be basically like pulled down and reassembled to become more neurodiverse and pluralistic by this historical force. I don't know. Or post-historical force, really. I don't know.
I go two places with that. The first one is the ambiguity between the kind of psychological and sociological adaptation of the neurological patterns generated by our use of communications tools that McLuhan's pointing to. Like the ambiguity between that and the notion of developmental complexity, right? Because there obviously are ways in which different systems of communication, just like different systems of energy production and things, co-emerge with people who have these different sort of dominant social levels of complexity. On the other hand, one of the things I think McLuhan was warning us about is it's not necessarily the next thing just because it's the new thing. Like we could randomly have adapted to the network patterning styles of electric media without that being actually the step forward, right? It might not be that what Integral thinks of and models of hierarchical complexity think of this post-formal stage of pluralistic complexity. That may have nothing to do with how we all become when we use interlinked electric media tools. So we just don't know exactly, right? Is it just what's happening now, or is it actually the new thing? Those could be the same, or they could be very different.
Yeah, well, I think part of that is just part of the problem there is in the way that that developmental trajectory has been represented in these conversations. I think actually, if we're gonna, lean even more on Ken's stuff, that the more orbital model that he was using in his earlier works, like Up from Eden, gets at this a little better. That modernity is the zenith of a parabola kind of, and that we at least it's non-linear. And people say, oh, well, like the helix or whatever. And it's like, that's still kind of,
Yeah.
a slinky is still kind of phallic, it's at any rate.
No, I agree. I always think about that stuff. Like, is there any reason why it should be, it's like asking 3s or 7s or 12s. It's a little bit too tidy. Should we be, that's not how Stephen Wolfram would approach this.
Yeah, although it's funny because Stephen Wolfram is like probably as far as male physicist, computer, self-congratulatory techno boner kind of guy.
He's the Captain Ahab
to talk about
of computation,
right? Like a new kind of science. It's like, well, not exactly, bro, not exactly. But yeah, it is. I really do appreciate the people who recognize that at the point that you are introducing networks and nonlinear dynamics into development, that this, Doug Rushkoff's narrative collapse, that's sort of like the Cassandra version, but it is, you do require a higher dimensional approach. And like Richard Doyle talks about this in probably the most brought up in every conversation I can book, Darwin's Pharmacy, where he suggests that the deformations of self-other subjectivity that are precipitated in what he calls the ecodelic experience, because he prefers using ecodelic as an algorithm for trip preparation over psychedelic, which has so much more baggage and is sort of weirdly navel gazing. That what happens he's saying is, no, you are folded over into the environment in a way that allows you to recognize that has always been the case, and that is training for the conditions of transhumanism. That like, in order to get where we're going, we have to turn our attention inward, but in so doing, we effectively like twist and close the Mobius strip, and so at that point, it's hilarious to talk about a linear developmental trajectory, even though you can in fact draw a line around the Mobius strip and then like project it into a lower dimension and make it look like you're traveling in a straight line, so that's where this conversation's going.
Yeah. For me, that all screams shamanism, right? Not just in terms of thinking about these states as part of a procedure that we can accomplish interiorly to complete that, but also something that's better thought of in terms of our ecology, but also in terms of a reality, like a neo-archaic reality that we're facing as a result of narrative collapse in the electronic sphere, right? Like when I think of, there's a lot of explanations about why Trump becomes president, but I think one of them is, hey, here's a guy who speaks in word clouds. He's very adapted to the McLuhan information environment. He's nonlinear, and he blows minds. He performs a kind of shamanic function. And you go, oh, we need that because we can't trust any of the structuring narratives anymore. So the only person we can turn to is anybody who looks like they have a significant amount of nonlinear astonishment, because maybe that's the guy who can navigate in this kind of environment, right? Turns out he's not a very useful person as an organizer of the country, but it's something that people are recognizing the need for.
I also like the magical working hypothesis for his election. The Pepe the Frog notion. Have you seen Feels Good Man? This documentary about the guy. Yeah, the guy the cartoon, I forget his name, the cartoonist who invented Pepe the Frog. It's a disturbing and awesome documentary about how his comic strip Feels Good Man was appropriated. And, it's a masterclass in mimetic dynamics, like mimetic evolutionary dynamics and mimetic warfare. And, the way that a symbol, again, to draw on like Doug Rushkoff, who wrote this really cool book, Alistair and Adolf, about the Second World War being won by a magical symbol, which was V for victory, which, at least ostensibly, I don't know the actual history of this, but Rushkoff proposes that British secret intelligence comes to Aleister Crowley and says, listen, we need a symbol of power equal to the symbol of the swastika. So what have you got? And, Aleister Crowley is like eating pussy and comes up with this, that he's like, oh yeah, V for victory, that it's life against anti-life, and that it's like the Vesica Pisces, and that this V is what won the war. So but something like that, the frog, which is, such a perfect symbol for the slippery, mutable, hard to pin down, again, like amphibious kind of person that you just articulated Trump as, is, it's a strangely perfect thing to take on a life of its own. And like, as this documentary explores the history of this, of the frog as a symbol in, or an archetype, you go back and you look at Kek in ancient Egypt and all of this stuff. And it's, that we do seem to draw back to what I was talking about earlier about like, the transitional complexity between order and chaos. We're right there at the water's edge here. We're in between two worlds. We're, Moses at the end of the pilgrimage, sort of looking at the Holy Land, or maybe we're Moses at the edge of the Red Sea, realizing that the pilgrimage is about to start. And at any rate, like we're the limbed fish, So the amphibious nature of this stuff is something I like to think about.
It is interesting as a totem of the moment. I sort of grew up with Lovecraft and Terence McKenna, so I often think about the cephalopodic totem of the moment. But the cephalopod is very well adapted to a particular environment, and it may be that what we're experiencing is a transition between environments. So that might be a better symbol. I don't know if you ever saw an episode of The Simpsons where Homer becomes a missionary on a tropical island, and his wife calls him and he's talking crazy, and she's like, "Are you licking toads?" And he's got his eyes are kind of like, "I'm not licking toads."
Yeah. Well, I mean, and that's a funny thing too, right? Because, to get a little Terence McKenna with you here, these different compounds seem to appear in history, or at least in society. I should probably stop using the word history. The fact that I keep using it and then keep checking myself is kind of symptomatic of what you're describing here. That these compounds appear in history at the time when they're sort of called forward. And so it is funny to note that there seemed to be a moment for several years there where ayahuasca was big. And then lately it's been 5-MeO-DMT, toad medicine, and then strangely also like ketamine. And, so I'm not sure how ketamine relates, but like certainly something about dimensional rearrangement. And then also like specifically, it's like reading our waking lives as though they are a dream, which arguably from the position of neuroscience, they are a dream bound by the senses. That it's worth, that it's a rich area of hermeneutic inquiry as to why it is that certain drugs take over in society at different times. And I think that, 5-MeO is like, here, It's like frogs, but also cats, right? Meow. And like, I guess that's it. That's the ketamine thing, is the, cats, and the internet is made out of cats. Anyway, I don't know.
We're definitely ready for some weirdness, or know that we need some weirdness to save us. That relationship between the organic and the inorganic compounds, it always intrigued me, because I have a scenario in my mind, and this goes to the word like ecodelic, because a lot of the psychedelics operate because they can temporarily take the place of the existing chemicals that you're using to make a map of the world. So they're basically structured like brain chemicals. And you're like, it's pretty weird that human brain chemicals are laying around in plants for billions of years. And what if, as a human brain chemical, it's somewhat subjectively aware, or can take an information imprint? And so it's like an exposed piece of camera film that's just been laying in all of the plants for millions and billions of years. So what patterns are now on that thing? And if I stick it temporarily into one of my neural receptors, am I going to see those patterns? Is it going to be ecodelic in that sense, an ingression of the organizing principles of the biosphere into my brain? I'm like, that's a great story, but it doesn't explain MDMA, LSD, ketamine.
Or maybe it does, right? Because one of the folks whose work I think stands to gain the most ground and also have the biggest impact, to the degree that it is actually capable of penetrating the market narrative without being just completely absorbed and appropriated and washed out, made useless, is Eric Wargo, who I'll be interviewing again for Future Fossils in a couple weeks, who wrote a couple books about precognition, retro-causation, and the unconscious. But he's a science writer for the NSF and a PhD anthropologist who in his spare time has been keeping a dream journal for like over 20 years and studying J.W. Dunn's experiment with time, and is now leading a kind of global citizen science community exploring the possibility that the brain is actually a four-dimensional object that uses that basically binds itself in time in order to ensure the survival of the system by like collapsing the field of future possibility by experiencing the future, and therefore limiting future events to that future which has been experienced. And he's able to like draw this all the way back to like the primordial soup, where he's borrowing from the work of quantum biologist John Joe McFadden and other people to suggest that like maybe this is how life emerged in the first place. John Joe's book Quantum Evolution poses that perhaps the sheer statistical impossibility of self-organizing life on this planet, at least as we understand it, given our Bayesian priors, is resolved by understanding things in this way, where because life interacted with the rest of its environment in order to reproduce itself, that's basically what collapses the wave function. And so it's not 1 over infinity that this happened, or functionally infinity. It's 1 over 1, because that's the only thing that brought this field of formless potential into form. And so Wargo is saying a very similar thing. And so that is all just to provide sort of a basis upon which I can stand and suggest that maybe some of these like research chemicals and other weird things that don't have an obvious history here, don't have that haven't been stained with the biospheric imprint or whatever, are actually future chemicals, that LSD, and this is where you get into the more sort of like Jungian archetypal or like time traveling UFO thing. Cause like, let's just bring that piece in here too. To the extent that we neglect the possibility that we're receiving information and possibly also visitors from the future, all kinds of things don't make sense. And then suddenly do, as soon as you set the taboo on the table for a minute and consider the possibility that the future is binding its own past in order to ensure its existence.
So a number of things we've been talking about have this interplay between causation and teleology, maybe, right? Like there's a question for me, like, and Aleister Crowley is a notoriously vain liar. So whether he really invented this or not, who cares? But the question is, are events being pushed into reality in a magical sense through actions, or are those actions somehow like iron filings picking up the magnetic field of something that's already existing in the future? And it looks like it's causality if you look from over here, but really they've been drawn in. I talked to Rupert Sheldrake the other day, and
oh, awesome.
Yeah, it was for a Rebel Wisdom thing, but I was talking to him about McKenna and about the tension between a universe that conserves its habits and then the novelty that's necessary in a universe that's moving towards something. And I brought up retro-causality, but he didn't really want to talk about that. But
oh, of course not.
But to me, that's fascinating. Is that kind of, I mean, Aristotle was touching on this too. How do we handle that tension between things are causing things to move forward in time, and there's a whole bunch of organization that only it feels like it makes sense if it's being drawn towards something in time? Because I'm a skeptic about the existence of the future, and therefore I'm hesitant about retro-causality, but I don't think there's a way of sensibly thinking about the present without imagining it has the morphology of a reflection from its leading edge, one way or another. Like whether there's really a future feeding that in or not, it seems like it definitely has that shape.
Well, one place that Eric Wergo and I disagree is he believes that this block universe model in which everything is basically already, signed, sealed, delivered, means that there's a complete foreclosure on free will, or that I mean, he says, okay, we just need to refigure free will in terms of like maybe I'm misreading him, but it sounds to me a lot like what Daniel Dennett is saying. Like it's sort of like good enough, it matters insofar as it matters to us subjectively. And this actually, this kind of rhymes with a conversation I had with Ken once upon a time where I was saying, okay, so if you push a third person inquiry far enough, you get to a point where your resolution fuzzes out, and like quantum physics, and suddenly a deterministic cosmos looks chaotic at the base layer. It looks random. If you push the first person inquiry far enough, then your will, your ability to act as a causal agent is, in maybe like something like in the way that it's described by Tononi and Koch's integrated information theory, that like your information is only so integrated, and eventually like you don't have control over your heartbeat, you don't have control over the dream, most of us, and so I think that we have arrived, the question of whether the future exists or not, the question of the directionality of causal flows, first of all, I think we have to acknowledge is an artifact of modeling this world, and that it's both and it's neither. That you got to bring in like Sean Hargens, when I had him, Sean S. Bjorn Hargens, pardon Vipassana, when I brought him onto Future Fossils 113, and he was talking about the way, we have to rise to the occasion of understanding the paranormal and like UFO phenomena by enacting Buddhist tetratic logic, in which something can be true, false, both true and false, or neither true or false. And again, it's so when it comes to, like Terence, I love that, you brought up the eschatological component here. Terence says, oh, physicists ask for one free miracle at the beginning of time. They ask for a big bang. I'm saying, why not ask for one free miracle at the end of time? And it's like, listen, okay, one free miracle is perhaps the minimal viable approach to being able to string things together in a way that makes some kind of sense. But it's kind of obvious that both of those are deviations from whatever else does not require one free miracle, and I feel like, to the extent that we know that our concepts and our narratives are us trying to kind of like nail down the waves as they come in to the beach, that it's not, that neither free will nor determinism are adequate. Both of them are, methodologically constrained. And yeah, I don't know. And also one more thing about that is that both of them depend on the granularity of observation, because it's not just about like which direction you're looking, but about how closely you can look. That, for instance, in evolutionary biology, most people understand that there's a deterministic factor, natural selection, and a random factor, mutation. But when you look at what's actually going on within an organism at the molecular level, all of the molecular interactions are governed by, these, like the rules, like the laws of thermodynamics. So Adi Livnat at Haifa University points out that complex behaviors, contrary to Darwinism and sort of more like Lamarckism, are in fact encoded into not just the epigenome, but the genome itself, because these genes are expressed at the same time, and therefore end up, because of basically water running downhill, like everything seeking its level, that genes that are expressed at the same time bind and fuse to become a single gene more often. And that looks a lot like Hebbian learning, where neurons that are firing at the same time end up forming links to one another. And so that's natural selection happening inside the genome, and so it looks random if we stand back far enough, or like stochastic, to use a formal physics term, but so does traffic moving in and out of a city every day. But then when you get in close enough, you can see people's motivations for going to work at this time or another time. And yeah, so I don't know. It seems all totally contingent on like who you're talking to and like what kind of questions you're trying to answer. But I don't think that we're going to get any kind of, universal insight from either of these approaches.
I think my personal feeling is that in order to get any substantial improvement, we'd have to go to a model that sort of intrinsically explained why we're not going to get those answers from any of our models, right? I have this thing in my head all the time called the metaphysics of adjacency, where you basically are going to take 100% and 0% just off the table. Like, you're never dealing with intelligibility or unintelligibility. You're always dealing with degrees of un/intelligibility, right? Is it random or is it pattern? You're like, well, yeah, it's always some mixture of both of those. You never get to it's absolutely not one of them. That just doesn't come up. So that the structure of the universe is always that thing you were describing about pushing a third person perspective far enough. It's going to fuzz out. They're all going to fuzz out. They're constitutively fuzzed out, right? I feel like Gödel was trying to say that, right? That you can't have a self-consistent, coherent mathematical thing that validates itself. It's open at the end. There's at least a little bit remaining that would have to be validated by something else. And this allows there to be relationships. It allows there to be other dimensions of inquiry, which there are. So it looks like you need something like that to describe the kind of world that this is.
And that's why, the metacognition is so important here. I think that's, again, what Richard Doyle is really gesturing toward in Darwin's Pharmacy, and why he has been so insistent on the introspective turn, since writing that book, is that at some point you realize it's the Suzanne Cook-Greuter construct aware piece. It's just like, okay, we're just pushing words around on a game board at some point, and like you and I both love playing the glass bead game kind of approach, because you can shake people out of seeing things in one way. Michael Schwartz called it creative deconstruction. I like that a lot. But to what end? And the end is adequacy, you know? And like, as soon as we realize that all of this stuff is insufficient, then it gets really interesting. I was one of Rich's students, Vidur Mishra, just wrote a book called The Infoboros, that I got to do the cover art for that book. And, you know, he's bringing all this information theory and neurophenomenology and stuff together, quantum physics, into this book about recursion and mind and matter and information. And Vidur is an extremely advanced meditator for being an undergraduate student, like just a remarkably awakened individual as far as anyone I know can tell. And he just updated his Facebook profile picture to riff on his experience of going deep into a meditative state and seeing other people as like these holarchic blobs of flesh gibbering, you know, flappy mouth sounds, and, you know, that like getting into this whole thing where he feels himself and everyone else sort of oscillating in and out of a field of information, and information, you know, being this recursive thing. And, you know, somebody gave him a hard time for using the word I 25 times in his post. And it was just like, all right, well, you know, it goes back to the issue of proliferating cameras, you know, and it's like, okay, well, we're clearly at the point where, you know, you look at all the friction, the light and the heat that's generated by identity politics, and it should be obvious that we need a more nuanced language to do this. But ultimately, it should also be obvious that transcending the quadrants, you know, transcending the pronouns that we use to navigate, and the number of perspectives that we believe are sort of, you know, a minimal feature set of reality, capital R, even getting past that, even adding new pronouns that sort of suit a transhuman or posthuman subjectivity is just going to make, in some sense, identity politics even worse, you know, even more unnavigable. It's just like, you know, you might as well just like accept that like I is what works, you know, like don't reinvent the wheel. You know, you have to update I maybe, but it's certainly better to say I than it is to use the royal we. I mean, you're going to alienate more people doing that, or using, you know, talking about yourself as it. I remember Alan Shelton, who I used to work with, who was a student of Ramesh Balsekar, said that he went without using I or me for something like 6 weeks as an experiment, just to see what would happen to his subject, and that it worked wonders for getting rid of the subjective I, but that he had to stop because it was creeping out his wife. She was like, no, you're going to start talking like a normal person again, instead of saying Alan wants this. And, you know, anyway.
Yeah. I guess I'm in favor of everybody who wants to mutating and experimentally transfiguring their language and their categories and their self-identities. That's great. But at the same time, there's this other part of me that always, it's even a little bit defiant. Like, I don't want to give up the battlefield before the battle. It always bugs me when people do this move where they let people they don't respect define a word and then treat that as if that's the meaning of the word. And then they have to choose some other word, which is usually a neologism or something barbaric that hasn't really been vetted by the passage of cultural time. You know, Bruce Alderman and I, working on the Foundation for Integral Religion and Spirituality, will run into this a lot. Like, what's the definition of religion? You talk to people and their experience of it is that somebody they don't like defines what religion is, and therefore they are not religious. And I'm like, why don't you define it in a way that's meaningful to you? If you think they're idiots, then idiots don't get to define the word. Give me your best definition. That's how you should be engaging with language. Instead, you're allowing language to be separated from you. And that may be symptomatic of a larger sense of meaningful disengagement from the system if we don't feel like the terms are our terms, because we try to update them by switching them rather than deepening them.
Well, you know, to that point, there's Stuart Brand of Long Now Foundation. He wrote this book, How Buildings Learn. And, from his, I forget who it was. He was working with a master architect, and he developed this idea of pace layers, which I don't know, the idea being that the bones of the house, the foundation, are the most conservative. And then, you've got the electrical system, everything going on in the walls, you've got the walls, you got the roof, but then you've got the, appliances, and then you've got the artwork that you hang on the walls. And so all of these different things change at different speeds. Each one has a different frequency at which it is responding to changes in the environment. And so many different systems are this way. And so he developed this thing about pace layers, which is like geology changes the slowest, and then, like fashion changes the fastest. And then in between, you've got, government and biology and all this other stuff. And so, when I think about the function of creative deconstruction, it's like, you're not trying to, so many people come in with a word and think that they're just, they've got this like postmodern, like, I'm going to make it whatever I want. It's like, no, you're not. This thing has bones. And at some point you're going to tear, that approach can only, skeletonize a word, and then you can build it back up from there. But, when you talk about religion, this is one that I was like, you can take that pretty far, but ultimately, etymologically, it's to reconnect, and like the buck stops there. Whatever else you want to change about it, you're not going to change that, because that channel is cut deep, to talk about a Rupert Sheldrake kind of, morphic field analogy here, that there are, cultural appropriation only goes so far, or reterritorialization of something. And so it's, I find it helpful to think in those terms about, again, like, why was the frog such a powerful symbol? It's not random. It has some sort of deep archetypal charge or history or habit attached to it. And so, when it comes to, and it's same with, V for victory, right? That was the whole point, was that it was anchored in the body, and in sexuality and in, the generative forces of the cosmos. So like, that's what you're looking for. And so, yeah, I mean, I think J.F. Martel would agree that in that sense, symbols are bedrock at the point where, like, there is a layer that we just don't have the technology, even though you can shuffle pace layers. And arguably that's what the Anthropocene has done, has made technology and culture move in such a way as to, they have like, the tail is wagging the dog. Like, we have leverage on the geosphere now, and we're able to shift things that move very deeply and very slowly. Not necessarily a great idea, not necessarily, I mean, don't give yourself bone cancer, right? But anyway.
Well, there's definitely got to be a variety of communication mechanisms between the different pace layers of a system, right? Like, I always think about, internal subsystems are a big part of how I think about generating spiritual experience, the coordination of things of which heart, mind, and body are a very primitive set. But that's a good example because people can relate to it. But those are operating at very different timetables, because you can set yourself to think of something, and then it comes back later, but often thoughts are going very quickly and the body is going relatively slowly. Like, you do some hard work and you feel like you're fine, and 2 days later you're like, oh God, like, why did it take 2 days to register? So these things are intriguing to me. Or I'm going to sit down in meditation, and like, a lot of people make the rookie meditator mistake, which is, it's not immediately working, so I stopped. I sent myself the calm down signal or the be alert signal or something like that, and it didn't happen. So it's not working. But you're like, no, it's going to happen 10 minutes from now. So there've got to be these ways in which the layers are interoperable, or operating between intraoperable, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And, the same, people talk about task switching, and I'd be interested to see, because that seems like one of those, when people say, oh, we studied people and we found out it takes 23 minutes for you to redirect your complete attention back to whatever it was before you got disrupted. And it's like, well, that's assuming a particular network of percolation that, like how long does it take the coffee to like make it through the grounds and into the cup, but if you grind your coffee at different levels of coarseness, the coffee is going to run through at different paces. And so, in a way, the meditative practice might be something like ungrinding the coffee so that the water just pours through. I don't know.
It could be. It's fascinating to think of in this way, because really everything we've been doing has been pace layered all along, and we just normally don't think of it, like right down to these speech patterns, right? A little bit slower, a little bit faster, it would vanish right out of our speech perspective. I was just watching a thing about how we were just always thinking crocodiles were just holding their mouths open for no reason. Turns out they're emitting ultra slow frequencies of sound that you can see it makes the water ripple that we can't hear. So we never checked on it before. But every meaningful signal exchange system has always been happening within a range. And so we've always been in this multi-tempo system of every aspect of reality we look at has been operating in a multi-tempo fashion. But it's really hard for us to remember that and take it seriously.
So to that point, Timothy Morton, object-oriented ontologist and author of a number of books, including Hyperobjects, Philosophy After the End of the World, I think is the subtitle. He talks about this, the hyperobject being this thing that is this so vast, so intricate, and also notably like discontinuous, at least within the way that we partition things in our attention. He gives examples of like radiation and global warming as hyperobjects in which we are embedded, but which required a long-term thinking, and even in order to recognize them as existing at all. We needed to expand our spatiotemporal framing in order to recognize our participation in them. And, he argues that Einsteinian relativity has not yet really done its work in philosophy and in the way that we think about causation, because in Einsteinian relativity, it's, there isn't, again, we're back to this sort of like pluralistic, everyone's got a different reference frame as far as like where now, past, and future are. And so he says the logical extension of this is that time is not a thing in which we are. Time is something that is emitted by objects according to their influence on one another, or like a physical way of saying it would be like mutual information, which are, if quantum gravity turns out to be a thing, then, like black holes are these gravitational singularities because they're high informational objects, and so like a city is sort of like a baby black hole in the way that a city functions as an informational attractor into which people are pouring, and that's why like you can talk about, like Terence McKenna riffing on the eschaton and the New Jerusalem, right? And the way that the New Jerusalem is the city at the end of time. And so that's the thing towards which we're all being pulled. And like, then you go to like Times Square, and actually, again, J.F. Martel and Phil Ford had a great episode of Weird Studies just recently on shadows, and talking about how like basically modernity is the New Jerusalem. Like it's everything is glowing all the time. New York is the city that never sleeps. And so that's the bright apocalypse, to use a Stuart Davis thing. So that's actually, a black hole looks black from the outside or whatever. Yeah. So in that sense, retro-causation actually becomes very easy to understand. It's just sort of like we're embedded in these hyperobjects that exert what looks to us, because of our holarchic juniority or whatever, because of our smallness, it looks to us like it's influencing us, it's pulling us from the future. But that's the present, like the future of the biosphere is, for us, is on this such a long, slow beat that, we've been on that single waveform, that single, crest to trough now for all of history. And so that's sort of like what enables prophecy, and what would enable precognition in that sense, that like, and that would, when I talked to Carrie Welch for Future Fossils episode 45, she studies the philosophy of time. And we were talking about some of Rupert Sheldrake's experiments with dogs and, knowing when their owners are going to come home. And she was just saying, like dogs are sort of perhaps more sensitive to the, it's not like necessarily a telepathic thing. It's just that they don't have anything drawing their awareness down into the high frequency beat that humans have. They're just sitting there unstimulated, and therefore sort of much more receptive to the future state of the system in which they are back. The owner is home again. And that would explain why you have to leave the city in order to have your vision, right? Because like everything is going so fast in here that you're like spaghettified, you're over the rainbow. Like if you go through the event horizon of the black hole, everything just stretches out, and like nothing, there's like an information thermocline or something. And so you don't, time for you has effectively stopped. But from the outside, it's anyway. So yeah, thoughts on lots.
First while you were talking, it's like I go to my recent default image of time, which is okay, I'm taking the future and the past out, but somehow it's all got to be able to coordinate because it seems to hang together. So there's momentums with trajectories, and they're feeding back, but this has got to be happening at the scale of every kind of nowness that there is. So these different time scales of nowness. And then when I think about that, I always feel like it's a bit like McKenna's hyperobject at the end of time, but it seems very organic to me. I always picture a hummingbird, like a half a second into the future, just facing me, and it's iridescent and it's buzzing in some strange way, but it's got this organic feedback structure. And yet all of that's what it's like to be any holon. Right. Every time that spot is a junction spot where a next one where you would dock with the next emergent higher holon. And you find that same effect at every scale. And so you also find it at the scale of your self-awareness, which in certain experiences, you're like, yeah, everything's being generated here and now.
So there's three things that reminds me of. One is the solar plexus will arrow that emerges from the chest of Donnie Darko when he's having his revelation. One is the Alex Gray painting Seraphim docking on the third eye. And then one is actually a trip report that Rich Doyle gives in Darwin's Pharmacy, where he talks about the bird that you're talking about, like the appearing before him and beckoning him forward into the transhuman or the ecodelic. So yeah, I think that is a part of our subtle anatomy, I guess, and it takes getting beyond the gross anatomical perception, like the shift of awareness, which happens as we move in to, again, to borrow from and riff on J.F. Martel in his book Reclaiming Art in the Age of Artifice. He talks about the spectral and modernity as the spectral. That everything is illuminated and electric. And so we're in an age of where we're turning our attention from the particulate to the field-based or like waveform-based stuff. And in so doing, then, you recognize that, okay, maybe like, to anchor this in something that's kind of blowing the world up right now in an awesome way, Michael Levin at Tufts, he's a biologist who's been researching bioelectricity and embryonic development. And I think I mentioned him to you when you told me that you were about to interview Rupert Sheldrake, because he's showing how the structure of electromagnetic fields determine the outcomes of agentic decisions made by cells as they structure an organism. So shaping electrical fields, you can like grow a head on the tail of a worm, or you can like give it extra limbs and stuff. And you're not changing the genome at all. You're just changing the field of information within which the genome is expressing itself. And so, so we get to this point where suddenly it becomes really, really sexy and alluring to talk about rainbow body and so on. Was it Mae Wan Ho, The Rainbow and the Worm? My buddy Farsam Shadab turned me on to this book years ago about some of the early, really subversive research into bioelectricity that resonates very, very much with these older ways of articulating the gross body as something that precipitates within an interference pattern of fields. There's
something fascinating here about different kinds of control surfaces, let's say, right? So that if Susskind's right and the information in the black hole is actually on the 2D surface of the black hole, or if the choice about how to manipulate what goes on in my body occurs at the level of the outside edge of the electric field that constantly feeds back through, or if the surface of the cell plays an instrumental epigenetic role in determining which bits of the DNA are going to be called into play, right? So it's a whole shift rather than central control, surface control. And I mean, I've been thinking about this for years because I used to take the bus past this place called the Center for Self-Awareness. Every time I'm like, why is it always a center? Why isn't this called the periphery for self-awareness? What's going on here? Folks, we live in a new space age, don't we? Gone is the dark epoch of tribal warlords, kings, popes, presidents, legislatures, and viable public institutions. They never seem to get anything done anyway. It always comes down to the financial innovations of a handful of high-tech oligarchs who have no choice but to capture our broken regulatory and public choice-making system in order to get things done and, frankly, to save us from ourselves. And if you're anything like me, you probably feel like it's high time to give something back. Well, I'm no expert on time, or am I? But maybe the time is now. Introducing the Integral Stage's new sponsor, the Fellow Logos Foundation. It's a private charitable organization whose very engaging, almost addictive new app helps source decentralized gratitude from folks like you and me and get it flowing in the right direction. You just tap your card on your phone and stock up your Fellow Logos Buddy account with useless old government-insured money, and it automatically converts into a distribution of cryptocurrencies that intelligently seeks out the top dozen private commercial space enterprises. Humanity has long been inspired by space, and even longer longed to see its billionaires briefly go almost there. With the Fellow Logos app, you can stop being part of the problem and become part of the solution to helping the leading edge of our evolving civilization symbolically copulate with the sky. It's easy to say you're cosmocentric, folks, but it's even easier to do something about it. Head over to your Google or Apple store to pick up the Fellow Logos app and start uploading currency. And with the promo code TIS!, you can give up to 20% more each month. Now back to our interview.
I have my hypotheses, but they're not political. They're impolite. I mean, that really speaks to, the cognitive dissonance that I experience working even at a maverick institution, because you need a spine to stand up in the world. But, to the extent that I understand this sort of network ontology and control surface thinking, I wonder every day I go to work how we can better route information and causal flows in organizations such that feedback makes it into the organization. Working in science communication and social media, we're getting a lot of stuff from the margin of this n-dimensional communication structure that isn't making it into the cell. And to me, that looks a lot like people's votes not mattering, and of course, like to some extent that has to be the case. Yeah. It gets us back to like the sweet spot. Like, if you are just completely empty and vulnerable to environmental impact, then you're like a hurricane. You're not a rabbit, like there's no informational integrity in time.
Yeah.
Only a responsiveness in space. And, certainly the world has plenty of conditions in which, it's a hurricane and not a rabbit. Right. But like, it does seem that the sweet spot, the sort of colonial organism, to draw on work that David Krakauer led on the information theory of individuality, that humans are colonial organisms, and so are our institutions and our organizations. And so knowing this, how do we, I feel like this is probably the $64 billion question right now, as people experiment with new modes of governance on the blockchain and online and in, cloistered spaces. This question of how do we integrate the top-down executive control and the bottom-up reflexes? How do we integrate this slow, deep beat at which information is aggregated, considered, and acted upon, with this rapid, responsive, highly adaptable approach at the margins of things that keep things, creative and keep things fresh, that allow us to respond to the world in such a way as to retain our flexibility and our it's very much that, like the Tao Te Ching, the bending tree doesn't break.
Yeah. And keep it, agile.
How bendy do we need?
Robust and adaptive and all these things at the same time. And so it seems like one of the traditional answers is the intersubjective one, is that we have to have a higher quality of relationship. And yet that doesn't necessarily take into account that people who hate the systems they're in might sometimes get really good results. And sometimes people who practice tremendous intersubjective exercises, it never translates into anything in the world or in any kind of better system for doing things. Right. I would think if regardless of what Buddha was, if Buddhism worked, we'd have a world full of Buddhas now, right? So there's some kind of limitation on its capacity as a social technology. None of these systems have really paid off, and maybe it's because their assumptions about how you operate interpersonally are below the level of their subjective sophistication. But then there's other.
Oh, I can say, or it's just really to get back to that sort of, the pace of the city versus the pace of the monastery or the pace of the mountaintop. I mean, who gets paid to meditate? Exactly. Very, very few people get paid to do that, and then the rest of us are householders or, wandering murderer desert weirdos, like that's, there's a beat there. And I this is why I feel like, I was talking about this with Nick Brycewicz, who's the director of strategy for the Long Now Foundation, yesterday, about how it takes the privilege of stability to be able to talk about the long term. Mm-hmm. And yet the long term is also, long-term thinking is also supported by our ability to respond to change. And, there's this sort of diverse ecosystem. And I think that we've lost that ecosystem. And this is a key pillar in the thematic pantheon of future fossils. We've lost that ecosystem in our obsession with the fast and the young. Mm. And, I worry that, this is a key piece of the, integral spiritual conversation also, is the restoration of eldership.
Sure.
And like, how do we, because at some point, like if you are still growing businesses, making money, then you're not out to pasture in a way that allows you to have the kind of insights that you are going to contribute to society the most, And so I'm deep, just as a sort of pin on that, I'm deeply concerned about gerontocracy from life extension technologies, because we don't currently have a structure where it's not just like wealth condensation forever. I mean, this is a very like millennial, okay, boomer kind of line of reasoning here, but we do need to figure out, in the same way that Tyrannosaurus as a juvenile or an adult, to bring dinosaurs into this conversation finally, partitioned the niches in their ecosystem so that they were not competing over the same food. Nobody wants their mom to be hitting on their boyfriend, right? And like, we need to figure out how to like create that extra layer of dimension, like deepen the soil that modernity eroded by a fixation on like one particular pace, and that pace is fast, and one particular strategy, and that strategy is growth. Yeah,
it's a weird system if you get a youth obsessed gerontocracy. But we may be getting a more and more extreme version of that. I think it's not just the pace of modernity that creates this, but also the fact that modernity incentivizes tactical communication, right? It creates marketing, and it's easier to manipulate younger people and to put that sense of youth in the foreground because they're more likely to take purchasing risks and go for things they don't want. So there's that, but also there's this, there's a communication problem in which we don't necessarily respect and learn from the people that have the pace of the elders and the experience of the elders. But also there's a missing elders problem, is that most of us haven't experienced many elders. A lot of old people are not elders. They're just old people, right? They're basically 12-year-olds in a broken down body or something like that. So we've lost a lot of the social, environmental, circumstantial factors and the cultural lore that causes a large number of the elderly to be elders, right? And when we run into an elder, we almost don't realize what's happening. You're like, wow, an old guy and he's still great? That's interesting. Why does this seem weird to me?
They're not just lost in nostalgia, right? For a more racist time. Yeah. Yeah, to that point, though, I really do think that we... you look at a quantitative historian like Peter Turchin saying that, for him, he's got this, what he calls the double helix of inequality, where inequality goes up and social stability goes down, and then they're inversely correlated. So you see this double sine wave going through history, and he put the crest of that sine wave at 2020. So like I regard that as kind of hopeful, insofar as I think we're at a point now where we're starting to see, the value of not just sustainable, but like regenerative agriculture in all of the possible ways that we can analogize that. And, a lot of people, yourself included, I see as regenerative farmers that are, like I have a bachelor in science because I scrapped my foreign language requirements to take more evolutionary biology seminars. And my friend Molly in the humanities says that I have a degree in BS now, but, as someone with enough Irish blood to be proud of my blarney, I recognize that, bullshit is not a bad thing. And that bullshit is required for regenerative pasturing, and that to that extent, I see my role in an organization as kind of like a fecal transplant, where it's like I might not match the DNA, but I swear to God, I'm helping. And it may not be like, pretty. It may not match the story that you have about yourself. You may not be like happy to admit to your friends over dinner that, that this is what saved your life, But I do think that we're at a point now where, and that's another Terrence thing, right? The mushroom sprouts out of the cow patty. So, it's there. We're in an age where finally we see the value of bullshit again, which is what Matthew Fox talked about is the return of the Black Madonna, the return of the repressed, and specifically the moral virtue of the repressed, of marginalized peoples, marginalized philosophies, taboos. I mean, that's not entirely great. I mean, that also means in the Lovecraftian sense, like the return of the old ones, like Jurassic Park is like, whoops, you crossed the beams. Like that was a bad idea. But we're at a point where the change is happening fast enough that the recombinant strategy, which is, includes bringing things that we had discarded back, matters a lot. And ultimately that is a very biomimicry kind of approach, is getting past this idea that there is such a thing as pollution, finding a way to close every economic loop and utilize every, all of the waste that we can. And then at that point, what limits us is, just the amount of entropy produced by that kind of process. And I suspect that at the end of this cycle that we get to rest, that we have restored all of the self-maintaining processes of this new, technospheric wilderness and integrated them with the biosphere and the noosphere in such a way as we can all just, kick it and get our universal basic income, and everybody will get paid to meditate because, we as human species will have been put out to pasture and we can just contribute our wisdom to the machines. That's a weird place to take it, but I think that's where we're headed.
Well, I think we obviously need, politically, we need to be creating a culture that's anticipatory and depressurizing so that we can, because we have to take that ease off, and we also have to be prepared for not only the accumulating results of everything we've been doing, but also the surprises that are definitely going to be hitting us out of the blue all that time anyway. And that requires us to, like you were saying, we got to be able to accelerate the formation of new kinds of social groups or social organizations that might be able to participate in that. And one of the things they need are, like we were saying, better people and better relationships, but also, like you were just saying, there's a whole range of things we might not have noticed that we might have to add to this. We might need bullshit. We might need things that were lost in the archaic. We might need levels of being that we find upsetting or just never notice that have to be brought in. We probably need some kind of Nassim Taleb mechanism whereby we have to be able to suffer from the outside results of the decisions made within the organization, or the organization loses contact with reality. If the decision makers aren't affected by the decisions, of course you get shitty decisions. And then there's a question of, like, the mathematics of it. How do you actually vote? How do you compile multiple signals from multiple people in a way that produces a maximally informative, actionable outcome? You mentioned voting earlier, right? It's just preposterous that somebody can make a decision for everyone with a 51% majority. That means half of the information is missing. But it's even worse than that if you get elected and you only have 30% of the 10% of the people that voted. I'm terribly frustrated by rating systems and recommendation engines online. And one of the things that always leapt out to me was the difference between how Metacritic and Rotten Tomatoes used to be. Rotten Tomatoes would give a thumbs up or a thumbs down, and Metacritic would give you like a score out of 10. So you're like, great, yeah, maybe I like this 90%, but on this one, if I liked it 51%, that counts as 100%. That's deeply misleading. And yet we sort of organize our whole reality around a thumbs up or a thumbs down. So I don't know what I'm saying here, but I'm just really concerned about how we get better, quote unquote, voting at all scales.
Well, once again, flying the flag for pluralism, ranked choice voting, as well as a more holarchic kind of approach to things. I'm really for this sort of defund the police argument that the problem is that we just put every responsibility on the police, and that's insane. And that, we need a much more diverse emergency response taxonomy, and the rank choice thing is interesting too, in other ways, for the way that it, if everybody voted this guy as their second pick,
yeah,
and so he has like a 98% majority, as she has a 98% majority, then yeah, I mean, it shouldn't that count for something?
Absolutely.
And then also if we have regions, for God's sake, maybe the 5 major industrial economic regions of the United States should all have their own president. Like, maybe it's time for us to get a layer in between just governors and presidents. Maybe we need something else that, and maybe, it seems to me like the city is making a huge comeback in terms of it being, a dominant or a prominent layer of, causal and political and innovative influence in the world for those reasons.
Voting style wise, I think ranked choice is a definite improvement, although there's still some errors there. Like, we're ranking people until somebody gets to crossing that 50% line. So you're still leaving a ton of things out, even though I think it is objectively smarter. But let's say you get Eric Adams in New York with ranked choice voting. What happened to all the people who wanted Yang? They still are dropped out of the system. That information is now missing, right? And you can go to something like proportional representation, where those Yang people would be there, but then what counts as the groups that are getting represented? And that, I think, is an enormous problem that relates to the other thing you were saying about cities and regions, which is what's really a region. I think cities are making a comeback because that's a real functional zone. The state of Utah is not a real functional zone. It's a box on a map, right? So it needs to be anchored in different ecological niches, biospheres, cities, things like that actually operate. Otherwise, what you're uploading to the next scale in the system is a total fiction.
Yeah, totally. And again, that's why, to look at this, to take that sort of political argument into personal psychology, it gets into this, again, like all of this stuff about what is a human being, what am I really? And just how insufficient the idea that I end here at my skin really is. If you look at it again in terms of information dynamics or metabolism, Jeffrey West at SFI has this, this chart on a biophysical scaling chart where, an elephant is basically just a giant and thus slowed down shrew, right? And so you get this 3/4 power scaling law about metabolism, which has to do with like the fact the distribution networks, nervous system, circulatory system, et cetera, are in 3-dimensional space. And so the volume grows at a different speed than the surface area of the organism. And so, all of that is to say that humans, you would expect to fall on this line, but we don't. Every other mammal does, but we don't, because we are in the way that, like, have you seen that how many slaves do you have calculator online? No. Right? No, it just counts. It counts like basically like the amount of work that's being done in order to support you in this world. And so you think about, like, this conversation is not just you and I sitting here, right? It's you and I interfacing through this global telecommunications infrastructure that depends on, all of these, global agricultural systems and so on. And it's interesting to me that when Jeff West does the math on the caloric intake of human beings, it's like something like 35 times what you would expect based on these biophysical scaling laws, which is to say that at some, like, the history of civilization is actually about each person out, like, the majority of the growth has been technological and social, and like social codes and contracts and cultural understandings and so on, such that really I, as a human being, am, if you were to like gather me all in one place, I would be like the size of a Tyrannosaurus. It's like, that's huge, and so we need to in order to make any sense of, in order to properly make decisions in a century like this, we need to bear that in mind. We need to understand that we are hyper objects, every one of us. We are a gauze of complex interrelationships, like spread over the planet, as one way of, one crucial way of seeing us.
Yeah.
So like, how does governance work in that space? Because it's no longer limited by geography or blood relationships. It's what William Irwin Thompson calls the noetic polity.
I think we have a huge need to make our supposedly human systems match up with supposedly natural systems in order to get workable things, right? There's got to be more fidelity of the operating patterns in that one space to the operating patterns in the other space. And we like that, right? If we build a home that feels more natural, or if I paint a picture of a tree, I go, oh, there's something nice about that. And it seems like it's operating in all these dimensions where we need to make our organizational patterns match up. So one of those things is like, yes, cities are real. They're there in the system, or these mountain ranges are real. They might make a good boundary. But it doesn't stop there. That would just be a huge step past where we currently are. You'd have to keep going and look at those things in the same way that you look at an individual as a hyperobject, as a distribution of some kind over time and space and in different mediums. So you're like, how do I start creeping towards mapping that? Like, that's okay. What is a thing? And okay, if I'm here and I'm here and I'm here, and part of me looks like this and part of me looks like that, and part of me was at this time, that's a me, that's a thing. And I don't want to get that mixed up with just a random collection of parts. This is one of the things I brought up with Sheldrick, is this question of what kind of a thing ought we to consider whether it has interiority or not. Like, maybe we want to check on the sun, but we don't want to check on a bag of pencils with a hammer in there. And then in between there is like a tornado or a whorl in your bathtub. It's minimally self-organizing. Should we be examining it to see if it has subjectivity, or is it not yet past some threshold? How do we do our grouping into a thing at all? It's severely uninspected.
That is another thing that Peter Watts explores in Blind Sight, because the team of scientists that he sends out to this alien encounter mission in 2093 or whatever, every one of them is some kind of transhuman, and every one of them is neurologically, anatomically distinct. So our protagonist, the science communicator, I have perhaps like self-interested reasons for loving this book, he has half of his brain replaced by a computer that is, this advanced machine learning algorithm. To get back to the point of this is really a science fictional metaphor for kind of like a bicameral mind, where he is capable of understanding all of these other scientists on the team because he has this a remarkably advanced pattern recognition algorithm that allows him to step down all the stuff that they're saying into something that normies can understand, but he doesn't know how he's doing it. He is a black box unto himself, and also, kind of like autistic in a way. And there are other members of this mission that have themselves organized diffusely into systems of the ship, so they're capable of, in a kind of like a Saruman way, like observing things from multiple perspectives at once, but only because they regard their flesh and blood as just a tiny component of what they're actually subjectively experiencing. And then others have, the linguist of this mission has partitioned herself. So she's running quad core identity. So whenever she has a new problem that one of her 4 personalities can't solve, she passes it to another one of the 4 personalities, and then the captain of the mission is a genetically resurrected vampire, because one of the most hilarious conceits of this story is that it turns out that vampires were a subspecies of humankind that we remember genetically, which is why they appear in our myth, and that they were predators on Paleolithic human beings, but that they had an optic system that was wired differently than ours. And basically, like savant thinking is a genetic holdover from interbreeding with them. And so like there are these basically like sociopathic super savants that we were able to defeat because they had a glitch in which the cross shape, you know, like they can if you throw 100 coins on the ground, they can count them immediately because like the optic nerve is processing all the, like retina is processing all this stuff. So they're, you know, the way that computation is organized in their body is not as centralized as ours. And so they're capable of outthinking us, outpacing us. But we were able to come up with the right angle, which doesn't exist in nature and which jammed their visual system and allowed us to wipe them out. But then we have to bring them back into this like dystopian future because we need these savants to help us make sense of and outcompete the sophisticated financial algorithms that we've released into the wild. And so, you know, it's like there's so many different ways. Like every character in this book is a different way of slicing some kind of neuroscientific insight about what we are. And like the kind, you know, the way that the future is going to demand greater neurodiversity from us in order to navigate it.
Yeah, there's this sort of a meta-pluralism that's necessary for any kind of integral kind of framing at all, which is, yeah, everybody's got these different perspectives, but there's different ways to group and organize how those different perspectives operate. So what you need is like a team of those in some kind of structure where they're forced to get along and are closer to each other than they normally are. And if we get extra coherence out of that, maybe we've got something.
Yeah, and then of course, you know, at least in his dark version, nobody trusts each other, right? Because nobody understands each other, and so that's where we are, really. You know, it requires a leap of faith, I think, to work in that kind of a hybridity.
Seems like our notions of the hyperhuman are being thrown up to handle this kind of overwhelming and decentralized demi-reality that we've kind of blundered into, right? I don't think it's a coincidence that you get Trump and the massive resurgence of the superhero genre at around the same time. Somebody who stands outside of our normal reality parameters has to be able to handle this. It's, all right, who do we need to become? What type of hyperhuman is the telos pulling us toward itself? And do we have an opportunity to steer at all? Or do we have any say in the matter? Can I skew myself in the direction of the type of hyperhuman I'd like me and us to become, or the set of types of hyperhumans? This seems to me these are fundamental Nietzschean questions too. Like who's the overman really going to be? Because if we're not working on that, we're going to get screwed. We're not enough to handle the situations we're creating.
Well, that's very much to the Death of Superman DC miniseries, right? And, you know, Superman is knocked out of the picture, and instead of one guy that comes to replace him, you've got four. And every one of them is, you know, a sort of, you know, in like this, you know, Rudolf Steiner, like, or like Vedantic involutionary thing. You know, you've got the one thing that splinters into all of its different manifestations. And so in that sense, I think, you know, transhumanism is kind of in its luciferic impulse misled, because the future that we're actually getting, and this is the core theme of the book that I pray that I have finished this year. Oh, see, there's the, I don't know if you can hear that, but that's the 2-year-old banging on the door. Let me in. That's the entropic future that we're talking about here. You know, the future is not one thing. It's more things, right? It's more kinds of things. And so, you know, to the extent that anybody has an accurate prophecy, it's really, it is still subject to the local biases of, you know, self-reference and what Artemy Kolchinsky at SFI calls semantic information. You know, that's his way as a physicist of describing the basis for meaning, that what meaning is information that's relevant to the persistence of a system. Everything else is noise. And that gets back to, Eric Wargo's point, which is, he's like, well, yeah, I mean, we do see the future all the time, but most of it's noise. Most of it's irrelevant to us. And only that which is relevant in some kind of rewarding way makes any kind of sense to us at all. And so, futurism is therefore inherently and endogenously fraught because, for the same reason that I love Blindsight, because it's about this distrusted science communicator going off to examine this like horrible, predatory other. And anyway, that's, everybody's got their narrative, Afrofuturism, the empowerment and the reclamation and justice, and I think the best that we can hope for is that we're all right somehow, that none of these are fatally in conflict with one another, which I think is ultimately the integral or meta-integral mission, right? Is let's find a way to set up the distributive networks of our systems such that we can minimize the friction at every branch point and thus get everyone what they need.
Yeah, it should be. I mean, it should be an opportunity to amplify meaning if meaning is what's pertinent to the unit, but the unit consists of a plurality of subsystems. And so if it's meaningful to multiple systems, then it should be experienced as more meaningful, right? Or the Jordan Peterson version of that is if you're solving problems over more multiple timescales of your own existence simultaneously, you get a stronger feeling of meaning in that activity. I tend to think of it as just all the internal parts, heart, mind, and body, and left and right, and conscious and unconscious, and perception of self and perception of other. The more of those things I can get coordinated with each other in a way that works for all of them, the more just background experience of meaningfulness I should have, which I might phrase to myself as being or something like that. But people who are capable of doing that, whether as an internal practice or as putting a whole bunch of different types of perspectives together, or as taking a whole bunch of layers and types of human needs into account in setting things up, those people should have a ton in common with each other and be able to work with each other in a pretty convivial way to generate pretty comprehensively good outcomes. So that's the hopeful version.
Yeah. I mean, and to your point, I think that's, you just bridged the difference between the two different definitions of meaning, because typically, in the Alan Watts sense, meaning refers to life. There is no meaning of life. Meaning as a featureless experience of the, of being itself is what you get when you have identified with the entire cosmos by stripping yourself of these conceptual identifications, or expanding yourself in a tantric way so that you can embrace it all, at which point even the noise is meaningful, and interestingly, we're back to that question about the pace of change of the environment and musical composition and rolling the dice, and how if things are changing fast enough, then even a piece of music that seems to have no harmonic structure in it whatsoever can still be meaningful in that deeper sense, because we have passed through the phase transition and into, I like the way that Eric Davis talks about this in his book, High Weirdness, and the conversations that we had about it, about what he calls metabolic ontology. That there is a state transition into which everything becomes meaningful because nothing is figured out, because you have managed to dilate your attention to the point that you are no longer, screening out most of the relevance. But of course, if you do that in a war zone, then you're insane. I mean, whether or not that's a problem is a whole separate question.
Well, I think to some degree, it's a matter of which part of you is doing that, right? And whether we assume that doing it has to mean it's the content of the conscious waking mind, or whether doing it is something that can happen more or less automatically in the background. There's a Harry Potter movie where the little girl gets a thing that allows her to travel in time so she can take multiple classes simultaneously. And they end up going back in time and having to stop this problem. And while they're back there, the head wizard, Dumbledore, he's helping them, but seemingly without knowing. He's distracting people and there's a whole scene where he keeps allowing them to perform their mission. Now, presumably because it's his past, he doesn't know it's happening. So the conceit there is that this guy's level of wisdom or whatever's gone on in him maturationally is such that he inadvertently acts with highly good timing in multiple time scales in ways that he doesn't have to know about.
Right. I mean, and again, that's the I didn't give the character's name, but that's Siri Keaton, the protagonist of Blindsight, who is, I look at that bicamerality as potentially analogous to that what you're talking about there. Again, and we are all doing this. I mean, that is the premise of time loops. Wargo's work is that all of us are Dumbledore, and we have an opportunity to, as we descend into the underworld again, which as we challenge the sort of linear narrative of ascent into a more unified humanity, but no, we actually proceed like Inanna and are stripped of all of our jewelry and our clothing and our identity, that we get to a point where they're in the gloaming or the deep sleep piece of it, that we we can be like Neem Karoli Baba and be like, oh yeah, I knew you were coming, Ram Dass. I knew you'd be here, because I had nothing else to distract me.
It's very difficult to figure out whether, and we don't have to figure it out, it's just there's an interesting boundary condition there. What counts as knowledge, right? What counts as the intelligibility of the future, right? If there's a person for whom everything that happens, each moment shows up to them as if they knew it in advance because their timing with time works really well. Maybe it works so well, it also seems to them in general that time isn't passing. Same way if you were on a wave surfing, the wave doesn't seem to be moving, right? It hasn't stopped, you're just moving with it. So this is perfect. Everything shows up perfectly to the point where I can't tell the difference between that and my cognition of actual information, right? Versus somebody who just has some kind of omniscience because the information is there and available and they learn to tap into it. I tend to favor the first one, but maybe just because it's more slippery and complicated and I like those things.
Well, I mean, it's the, sit in one place long enough and the whole world comes to you thing, which again, I think is what Rich Doyle is getting at when he says, stop it, stop looking out there, the introspective turn, close the loop. And then it's all here already, and you can just abide in it. Yeah.
Very.
Ultimately, is that what every seeker says?
Is it an inspecting and abiding, or is it a working? Like, is it an operation performed on those things? Like, I might inspect and abide and never do the thing. Now, I wouldn't do the thing unless I looked and hung out there long enough to see it and do the thing. But it's possible that I could show up and look at all the parts and just be there abiding with them and be inspecting them and never connect the one arrow to the other arrow, even though they've got arrows on them. And I think I'm doing the thing, and I tell other people to do the thing. Just look and abide. And actually, you're supposed to look and abide and then plug the circuit in or some other phenomenon or organize the things. Like, has the world come to me because I was sitting here, or was sitting here an opportunity where I performed an additional operation of like temporary super organization? And now getting what I need is the experience of that kind of perceiving. But I had to do it like an artist has to do something to improve the artistry of the piece of paper they're working with. They've got an active function. So I'm never sure about those two.
Nor should you be, because that question is a trap, Layman. That question is a trap because you're asking about the duality of doing and non-doing, and I'm not falling for it. It's
give me a quick answer and make sure it's one of those two options.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's just, isn't that the whole turn, out of Theravadan Buddhism into like, no, you're not getting out of this by heading in one direction. You will eventually head all the way back to where you started. Yeah. I mean, certainly it gets to the whole, by the Tao Te Ching, doing nothing, everything is done, and it loops referentially back to what we were talking about earlier about the completely, utterly bonkers and pointless debate between free will and determinism. Like we just need a better language to talk about this stuff if we want to talk about it.
Yeah, we can talk about a freer or a less free will in certain contexts, but whether there is or is not free will is extremely misleading, especially if everything turns out to be shaped like a Mobius. But on the other hand, there's different options that are hidden within things that we think we know the meaning of. Like two people arguing about God, and one of them is referring specifically to an infinite thing, one's referring specifically to a finite, powerful entity. Logically incompatible things passing under the same terminology. I thought about this earlier when we were talking about paces, because switching out of your so-called normal beta wave brain state, you've got two options. You could slow down into alpha or speed up into gamma. And if somebody says, hey, let's get you outside of your normal frame of mind, just sit here and watch the river, are you relaxing because of the river's constancy? Or are you speeding up because you keep looking at and trying to predict the river and it keeps eluding your prediction and you're going to this super high performance mode? It's a thing that comes out in some of the Zen literature around koans, which is some people treat the koan as a disproof of the fact that discursive logic can lead you to an answer and therefore put it down and enter into the background of consciousness. And other people are like, no. It's going to produce an explosion in your brain called the Kensho moment, which only comes if you try as hard as you possibly can to work out the answer. And yet both of those strategies are described by the same, oh, yes, sit down, watch the river, work on this koan, and then you'll shift out of your ordinary consciousness. So these two hugely divergent things are concealed in that same term. So we've got to somehow have that awareness at the same time as being aware of the fact that a lot of our options are tricks.
Right. I mean, again, speaking to that divergence in spiritual practices between activation of the sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system, sit there and meditate or be a whirling dervish. And yet I think maybe I learned about that stuff too early in my life, and that until you get to a certain age, you are probably better served just assuming the conceit and heading one way instead of the other, until you can finally get back. I mean, that was the whole thing about the Buddha and his wife. He comes back and he's like, I'm the Buddha now. And she's like, yeah, but did you have to leave? And he's like, well, in retrospect, no. At the time, yes. So, I mean, I think part of the narrative collapse situation is that, it's not just that people are youth obsessed into old age. It's that people are giving up on narrative structure before they're really ready to let go of the raft, And so I really hope that if you're under the age of 40 or something, listening to this conversation, that we don't just like throw you into some kind of conceptual riptide from which you never recover. Yeah.
I'm wary of the degree to which narrative's presence or absence is significant. I don't want to discredit it completely, but I think it gets exaggerated a lot. You were talking about Ken Wilber and the McLuhan problem of, being a book person and being embedded in that kind of viewpoint. And so much of our discussion for centuries has been dominated by professors, journalists, priests, authors, right? People who are heavily invested in whether or not there are narratives. And their solution seems to be that we're in a terrible narrative crisis. But of course, that would be their solution. And the people who've attacked go, well, there's really no real narratives or there's no overarching narratives. I think there's a step beyond that, which we might be able to get to, which is what are the things that produce the effects that we have associated with those narratives, right? It might be a switch from narrative life to practice life. And if you do these practices, you get the results you attributed to narrative, whether you have a narrative or not. And if you don't do them, whether or not you have a narrative ends up being the same kind of nihilistic death spiral.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder how you see that as sort of merging with or agreeing with, again, when we talk about the conservative bones of something, and going back to its roots and only being able to change some things so much. And, there's a larger body of evidence all the time that storytelling is fundamental because the brain absorbs, integrates, compresses information in a particular way, that it's something deeper than us, that there are structures that the brain has encoded in our environment, that that we are sort of the microcosm of something beyond the human, and that therefore the narrative structure is an adaptation to that, and that we can't, maybe we can strip it down, maybe we can make it mean something more fundamental, more profound than we currently think of when we think of story, but it remains the case, at least for now, that working memory is only going to hold, 7, give or take 2 objects at a time, etc. That every story has a beginning, middle, and end, that we talk about time in terms of past, present, and future, when there could be other more higher dimensional ways of talking about time. Why do we do that? I mean, here I am being what my buddy Mitch Mignano calls a psychedelic conservative, where he's like, you go out there on the mountain, you have your experience, and you come back and you tell people, actually, the reasons you're doing things are like, valid.
Yeah.
It's not arbitrary,
I realized you guys are fine.
Yeah.
Well, I would say, I think that what we conventionally call narrative might predominate as an organizational strategy at some particular level or layer of our being. But I also think that in the age of massive narratives, in which I would include like the age of writing, but also the age in which we are besieged by memes. They may be fragmentary for the most part, but we're certainly encountering a lot more chunks of story than any of our ancestors were adapted to handle. And it may be that that's an environment in which we need to be very skeptical about the role of narrative as steering us. And we see a lot of negative effects, like the manipulation strategies of marketing and algorithms are largely geared around steering us through narratives. So we might need to individually sort of decouple from our trust in narratives to gain the skills to handle a hyper or trans or meta narrativistic space. And we certainly might need to develop structures for living that can operate whether we have a good narrative or not, and which maybe put us in a position to facilitate the emergence of natural narratives rather than receive top-down narrative solutions, right? So in the age of super narrativization, we've been training ourselves and each other to tell stories as if they're stories. We've watched so many shows and heard so many arguments. But is that how stories emerged throughout most of human history? Like, most music didn't come from a musician. Most music sort of spontaneously emerged in a particular situation and environment. And there may be stories that spill out of us living correctly, rather than we're given stories in the hopes that it might guide us to live correctly.
Well, I mean, yeah, that gets back to, this question that all the perennial philosophy people are wrestling with, which is, the degree to which it is appropriate to titrate the universal and the particular, right? Like, it may be the case that narrative structure is universal to all, or, effectively all human brains. However, that doesn't mean that the content is, and I think you're right that we should be careful. Who was it I just saw recently? It might have been Jason Snyder on Twitter or somebody. If it wasn't him, then he's cool anyway. You should follow him. But they were saying, avoid general advice and seek contextual advice. That this is one of the core, biomimicry. One of the founders of biomimicry talks about, bespoke solutions. So I am really hesitant to say anything about everything. Yeah. And I think that that's where everyone should get.
Yes. In general, there should be no general solutions. I think that our sensitivity to a meaning crisis makes us very attentive to the religion-like stories that our ancestors told, but we have a limited idea of what religion was. We think of it, we only have it's survivor's bias kind of thing. There's like a couple of large examples that have persisted, and we're like, well, those are normative examples of religion. And what if they aren't? What if those are the weirdos, and that most of it didn't look like that? And if it didn't look like that, then there's some much more generalized procedure that creates these things in specific contexts that, I don't know, there's two parts to that. One is, how do you look at the stories as bubbling up when people are living together correctly? And then they're imbued with a numinosity that we think of as religious, but later we just have the story as a relic and think, oh, they must have believed this story and therefore got those effects. So there's a mix up there. Now I forget the other thing I was going to say.
Yeah, we're really bad about cargo culting everything as a species generally, and that speaks back to the importance of epistemic humility and conceptual or like theoretic openness, because there's always something that is going to challenge your model. Even like talking about everything in terms of entropy itself, I was saying for years and was delighted to see in Sand Talk that Tyson Yunka Porter went there. He's like, that's a closed system thinking thing, like you can do what Eric Wargo is doing and talk about, even in 4 dimensions, talk about an organism orienting itself towards higher entropic futures, but again, you're talking about things on a classical timeline rather than in a relativistic, like a network of influence.
Yeah.
And, entropy depends on you being able to look at a system in a particular layer of like level of resolution with a particular frame on it.
Yeah.
And say it's gone from one state of order to a different state of order. And that will, to the extent that our interiority is irreducible, that is always going to be true. Like you're going to draw the line somewhere because of your metabolism and the constraints, historic and otherwise, that weigh on your ability to pay attention to what's going on. Noise is we're never getting rid of noise, So that's actually a really fine place to be, because then you don't have to get anywhere, like you can work on a question or a problem without the expectation of solving it or thinking it will ever be solved. And the intrinsic satisfaction of being engaged in enacting the cosmos, steps forward and resumes its place at the table next to your goals, you know? So.
Yeah, I think there's a kind of Sufi logic there. You know, the idea is that, how do they say it? Like the fact that there is no God apart from myself is the reason that I embody that understanding by worshiping a God who is other than myself. And there's sort of like I'm on the way to something, but that's where the something is located, right? You don't sit down and meditate to become the Buddha. You sit down and meditate because you were the Buddha. Or really, moving toward Buddhahood is Buddhahood. It's dynamic self-definition. So that there's this, like, yes, I'm not moving from here to there in my attempt to move from here to there because there is no there and I'm always here. Therefore, I make this gesture, which appears to be moving. I'm working on solving a problem precisely because there is no outstanding existential problem.
Now what?